he did not handle it well. And he was really hurt by the little girl's reaction. Because, of course, I was there. I was with her. I saw all of the time, energy, and effort that she put in to picking out just the right gift for this little girl. And so for her to just kind of be so dismissive with it was disheartening, to say the least. What I learned that afternoon is what I think is a universal truth, and that is this: how we receive a gift is just as important as how we give one. Now, how that universal truth plays into what we're talking about this morning, it's simply because of a book that I read years ago on church hospitality. And I remember as I was reading this book, I saw a question there. I was hit with this quote that absolutely rocked my world. The question was this: what if every Sunday, one of the greatest gifts that God gives us as a church is the gift of first-time guests? If that's true, how are we receiving them? Are we excited, enthusiastic, grateful, intentional about the way that we receive them well? Or are we dismissive and indifferent? Do we just shrug our shoulders like that little girl and toss them to the side saying, we have enough people at this church already? To me, that is one of the most important questions that a church could ever ask itself. And the reason why I say that is because I have been to a lot of churches over the years. And I've been on the receiving end of a lot of hospitality from those churches. And one of the things I can absolutely guarantee you is that the vast majority of churches would tell you that when it comes to hospitality, not only is that something that they do really well, they would tell you it's where they shine. And the reason why they would tell you is because we are the friendliest, nicest, most welcoming church you've ever seen. You have never been to a church that is friendlier than ours. And you know what? For most of those churches, they would be right. They are really, really friendly. Just not to first-time guests. Amongst themselves and to each other, they're wonderfully friendly. But to anyone that they don't know or is new or they're unfamiliar with, not so much. Now, of course, in my experience, this is never intentional on behalf of these churches. I've never been to a church where they have been purposely inhospitable to a guest before. No, in my opinion, most times I think these churches are doing it and they don't even realize it. For instance, I remember back when I was in seminary, the late great professor of preaching, Fred Craddock, told about a time that he was invited to a big church in downtown Atlanta, and they asked him to come and preach for 4 nights in a row. And so he did. And he said it was a wonderful experience because it was a really big crowd, energetic crowd, big church, nice church. And I was really excited, he said, to have that opportunity to preach 4 nights in a row. Well, every night before he got up to preach, the minister of the church would get up into the pulpit and he would have what he called a moment of Christian fellowship. He'd say, all right, everybody, we're about to have a moment of Christian fellowship, so if you would, please stand up and let's greet one another in the love of Christ. And Fred Craddock said, as soon as he said that, you wouldn't believe the level of activity in the room. I mean, people were literally going all the way across the room and up and down the aisles. People were literally climbing over the pews to get to one another so they could hug their necks and say hello. He said it was the most amazing thing you had ever seen. And so after a couple of minutes, the minister would get up and he would say to the church, all right. Everybody just calm down. If we don't knock it off soon, we're going to be here all night. That happened 4 nights in a row. Well, on the fourth night, after the service was over, the minister invited Fred and his wife Nettie out to dinner. And while they were at the restaurant, the minister kind of leaned back in his chair and he said, "All right, level with me. Have you ever seen that level of hospitality in a church before?" I mean, have you ever seen a church that is that hospitable to one another? And that's when Fred Craddock's wife, Nettie, spoke up and she said, "Well, to be honest with you, I wasn't all that impressed with it." And the minister was flabbergasted. He said, "What? Wait, what? Are you being serious right now? Why?" And she said, "Because I was there all 4 nights and not a single person came up to me to say hello." And as serious as can be, the minister looked at her and said, Oh, well, that's just because nobody knew who you were." We have a lot of really friendly churches, but we don't have nearly enough churches that practice hospitality. And that, according to Bishop Robert Schnase, is one of the surest signs of a church that's not only strong and vibrant and vital and growing, but it's also the sign of a church that's fruitful. He said, a fruitful church is not just a hospitable church, it's a church that practices what he calls radical hospitality. It's the kind of hospitality that seeks to go above and beyond. It's the kind of hospitality that seeks to exceed one's expectations. He said the last thing this world needs is another friendly church. What this world really needs is a church that practices hospitality. Because do you know what the difference between friendliness and hospitality is? It's one thing. It's intentionality. It's having the kind of forethought and thoughtfulness that thinks ahead and asks the kind of questions like, what could we do here at our church to make sure that everyone would feel welcome? Like, what are the little things that we could put into place, things that we could do that would make someone feel right at home? Those little things are what I call acts of practical intentionality. And I would argue that those little things make a really big difference. For instance, a couple of weeks ago, I had to go over to Home Depot to pick up a part for my lawnmower. And if you're like me, sometimes I find Home Depot to be just a little bit overwhelming because it's a really big place with lots of aisles and lots of stuff, and I don't always know exactly where everything is. But I will tell you that my experience at Home Depot that day got infinitely better the second I walked through the double doors and there was a young woman there in an orange apron. And she came up to me immediately and she said, "Hi, welcome to Home Depot. How can I help you?" And I explained to her what it was that I was looking for, and she said, "Oh, I know exactly where that is." Now, in that moment, she had the opportunity to tell me where to go. She could have said, "Now you just go down to aisle 19, hang a left, it's there on the right, you shouldn't have, but a couple of minutes, you should be able to find exactly what you're looking for." That's not what she did. She said, "Oh, I know exactly where that is. Follow me." And she helped me navigate the maze that is Home Depot. And we went right to the exact aisle where it is. And within a couple of seconds, we found exactly what I was looking for. As she handed it to me, I thanked her profusely. And she said, "Oh, not a problem. Don't mention it. It's why I'm here." And that day, I realized that I will always go back to Home Depot anytime I need something. To me, that little act of hospitality that she showed me, that wasn't accidental, I hope you realize. That wasn't something that just happened by happenstance. It was like, oh, that was a nice coincidence that she was really, really nice. No, she was intentional about it. She wanted to make sure that the second that I walked through the doors, that I felt welcomed and I was taken care of. And if there was anything that I needed, that she would be willing to help. That kind of hospitality is what I call practical intentionality. And Robert Schnase says that that is exactly what we need to offer in the church. Because let's face it, going to a church for the very first time can be one of the most intimidating things we ever do. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, it's been a long time since I've visited a church, but I'm telling you, if you've been there, you know what I'm talking about. You know how intimidating it is to go on the website and try to figure out where it is you're supposed to go. Or when you show up on a Sunday morning, where do I park? Where do I go? What entrance do I use? Where are the restrooms? How do I make it from this building into that building? Is this where worship is, or is it somewhere else? There are so many different aspects to worshiping in a new congregation on a Sunday morning that are absolutely overwhelming. And so it is, Bishop Schnase says, we have to be intentionally hospitable to those people. Because what we want them to experience from the moment they come into the door is not just a sense of welcome, but we want them to feel at home. We want to lower whatever barriers may exist to let them know that we were expecting you and we're glad you're here. We especially want them to have a good first impression. Because as a recent Barna survey says, a first-time visitor at any church typically forms their opinion about your church, or they form their first impression about your church within the first 30 seconds. They've decided whether they're going to worship with you again or not within the first 5 to 7 minutes. Which means that long before we get to any prayers, or the choir sings, or the minister offers a dynamic, knock your socks off, amazing sermon, hypothetically speaking, of course, they've already made up their minds. They already know whether they're coming back or not. And 9 times out of 10, it's based on one simple thing. How did this church make me feel? Did I feel welcomed here? Do I belong here? Were they expecting me here? Do they even want me here? You know, sometimes you can visit a church and it feels like you've stepped into a party to which you weren't invited. You know, you can step in and you go, I didn't know I was intruding. Sorry about this. I didn't know it was a members-only club. Bishop Schnase says the way that we get around that, the way that we offer hospitality through that, is by acts of practical intentionality. But I would also argue that there's a second kind of intentionality that a church needs to practice, and it's what I would call theological intentionality. And what I mean by that is when a church practices radical hospitality, there is an understanding in that church that the reason we offer hospitality is not simply because it matters to us. No, the reason we offer hospitality is because it matters to God. And it's been that way from the very beginning. Because throughout the Bible, the number one most used word for hospitality is the word philoxenia. And what philoxenia simply means is love of the stranger. Now, where that all came from is actually from the book of Deuteronomy. Back when God led the Israelites out of Egypt, and they're just about to enter into the promised land, and that's when God says, all right, listen up. Here's what I want you to do. When you get into the promised land, I want you to practice philoxenia. I want you to extend love and hospitality to the stranger. Why? Because you were once strangers in Egypt. Don't you ever forget that. And even though you were strangers in Egypt, I, God, offered you love and hospitality in spite of it. And so therefore, I want you to extend that same love and hospitality to anyone who would need it, no matter who they are. Of course, in the New Testament, Jesus takes it one step further in Matthew 25, which we're going to read next week. But in Matthew 25, Jesus says, when you welcome the stranger, when you welcome the outsider, when you welcome the person that the rest of the world wants nothing to do with, spoiler alert, you welcome me. And so it is in Romans 15. The Apostle Paul is writing to the church at Rome, offering them final instructions. And what does he say? Welcome one another, therefore, just as Christ has welcomed you. Because what the Apostle Paul understands is that in the final analysis, it's not our hospitality that we're extending to others, it's God's. It's God who says, you're welcome in this place. You belong in this place. You have value in this place. You are loved in this place. Hospitality doesn't start with us. It starts with God. But because it starts with God, well, then it's a responsibility that all of us need to take on. That's why one thing I've always said at this church is, although we have a hospitality committee, meaning we have a small group of people who every single week make sure we have certain things in place so that visitors or guests would feel welcome, the hospitality committee will always be relatively small. The hospitality team will always be large. And by large,